Welcome back to Insight. In part one, we talked about the effectiveness of the World Health Organization, recently criticized for its response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa. Now, at the height of the outbreak, efforts were underway to create a vaccine and deploy it against the deadly disease. So what's happened since?
A new vaccine has proven to be almost 100% effective in combating the Ebola virus. The experimental drug, called RVSV-ZEBOV, was created by scientists in Canada. There are currently 300,000 doses of the vaccine available. The World Health Organization confirmed that a new outbreak of Ebola had occurred in the Democratic Republic of Congo last month. So far, 4 people have died. Officials have signed off on RVSV-ZEBOV in the DR Congo, but the decision on whether to deploy it remains up in the air. Uncertainties over the outbreak's magnitude mean that Congolese authorities and the World Health Organization must determine whether the small number of confirmed cases justify the cost and logistical complexity that comes with deploying the vaccine. Up to 90% of infected individuals die from the virus. With such high fatality numbers, critics argue that it is disastrous for public health to completely rely on the for-profit pharmaceutical sector to drive the process to develop vaccines.
Still with us is Leah Sarug, who is the science and health reporter from the International Business Times. And also joining us from Germany on Skype is the professor of medicine at St. George's University in London, Sanjeev Krishna, who is also a consultant physician on infectious diseases. Sanjay, maybe we can begin with you. Why, in the Congo right now, where we have an outbreak of Ebola, is this vaccine not being rolled out?
Well, the vaccine for general use would need to be registered, and it's still undergoing the final regulatory approvals that are needed for its registration. So it can be used, but under specified circumstances. And I think you may have mentioned that the DRC has already approved its use, but there are other difficulties in getting a vaccine to where it's needed in countries like
the biggest difficulty is that it's expensive to deploy it. Can you explain that? What happens?
Well, the vaccine needs to be stored at the right temperature, which means it needs to be kept very cold. And transporting a vaccine like this so that it's still working when it gets to where it's needed is a huge challenge when you're talking about an absence of infrastructure. You're going really in remote areas where even access by air may be very difficult.
You were involved in the development of some of this in the clinical trials. I think you mentioned before we sat down to do the interview. It was developed in Canada, but I think that's an important distinction, isn't it? Because it tells me that with will and money, you can conquer anything, like even a challenging disease like Ebola. But this did not come from the private pharmaceuticals. The WHO had to be involved in the clinical trials, and private money from the public health system in Canada was involved.
Yes, I think, our involvement was a small contribution to a very big consortium called the VEBCON Consortium, which was brought together, as you say, by WHO when the crisis was already at its height. The question of whether a vaccine can be produced and stored and then deployed when needed is an important one, because pharmaceutical industry is the industry that actually makes and stores this type of material, whether it's drugs or vaccines. And I think it's very much a partnership between all interested parties, whether it's the WHO, whether it's charitable funders who supported a lot of this work, like the Wellcome Trust, or whether it's other parties, governments, that can contribute to allowing access to this vaccine when it's most needed urgently.
I mean, that's all well and good, but I mean, just as a layman listening to this, and I think anybody would say, okay, you have an outbreak of Ebola again. Mm-hmm. Now you have a vaccine, but they're unable to roll it out there properly and quickly because of expense. A lot of people would think, well, what is the point of having the vaccine if you can't get it to people in the first place?
I think, well, I completely agree with you, but I would argue as well that it's already really impressive that after 2 years of efforts, we've already have a vaccine that has shown such efficacy in clinical trials. And
because they deployed it in the tail end of the last outbreak in 2014,
yes,
and they actually saw it worked.
Yeah, so I think that's already an achievement in itself. Obviously, there's this problem of deploying it. I think we should also mention that currently in the DRC, it's not just about vaccines. So there's containment strategies are very important as well. Prevention, going into the affected areas and speaking to a population. So obviously, you know, it's frustrating that the vaccine cannot be deployed because of hurdles like this, but when there are positive aspects, I think we need to mention them as well.
Frustrating no more for the families that need them and watching loved ones die, Sanjeev. I mean, a good example is H1N1, the bird flu in 2009. Some countries actually hoarding vaccine supplies. I mean, it's a big problem, the storage and deployment, and getting governments to move on this.
Yes, but I'd come back to the point made by your correspondent, actually, that the first steps in dealing with an outbreak like Ebola are very much the public health measures, which are critical. And if the outbreak can be contained, as it seems to be at the moment, contained by public health measures, because that's the first line before the wheels start rolling and vaccines start to become deployed and all the remaining hurdles.
But I mean, they thought, and I don't mean to jump in here, but they did think that they had contained Ebola the first time, or they were very slow to move on it. Do you think that the WHO is a credible organization when it comes to saying, yes, we've got it contained, or it's under control, or we don't need to roll out the vaccine right now, we don't need to go to a full emergency? Do you feel confident when you hear that now?
That's a very good question. I think there have been huge lessons learned, and lessons that are continuing to be learned from the dreadful outbreak that we saw 2-3 years ago. And, you know, I think we're in a different place when it comes to having learned how to respond in an effective way. And, you know, of course, you know, if a vaccine can reach where it's needed straight away, and we know that it works and that it's safe, of course, you know, common sense would dictate that it should be used. But remember, as mentioned, there are other things that can be put into play to contain an outbreak whilst issues regarding vaccines are resolved.
Do you believe another pandemic is coming?
Of Ebola?
A pandemic, a global pandemic. Do you fear that's coming?
Well,
because
you know,
that makes this discussion very poignant, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We know that disease organisms don't respect borders, and that's what a pandemic means, something that you know, affects a large proportion of the world. And to be honest, you know, you've mentioned flu as well, and I think that is a real risk for which people are, you know, quite aware in terms of trying to develop containment measures. So yes, I mean, we're all alert to the possibility of pandemics, but unfortunately, we're not always in the best position to be able to predict when they might arise.
Leah, do you think that the WHO has got lessons learned and adequately enough? I mean, they've been roasted. There's been 7 different reports on the Ebola outbreak in 2013, 2014. The first death was a 2-year-old boy in December. They didn't actually declare a full emergency by August, is that right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Have they figured this out? Can they respond to a more global situation and problem?
I think it's an ongoing process, you know, speaking to the candidates to become the next Director General of the organization. You could see that, you know, they've taken into account that there were mistakes that were made. They want to improve communication with governments. They want to improve transparency. So there is really goodwill, you know. Then we'll have to see, I suppose, what happens now that Dr. Tedros is in office.
Sanjeev, can I ask you, concern about Donald Trump, about the U.S., the way they fund the UN and the WHO? You're smiling. Do you worry about, with growing threats of pandemics, what's going to happen to the funding of organizations that need it?
Yeah, I absolutely do worry about this because, you know, pandemics don't respect borders. And isolationism is an attempt to artificially generate borders. And the two are contradictory when it comes to trying to solve problems which are global and which are disease-related. So, of course, I worry about this. We do need more resources in international organizations to try and strengthen our resilience capabilities when it comes to diagnosing and containing infections.
Sanjeev, Krishna?
These are going on.
Sanjeev and Leah, I think we're out of time, but it was a great discussion. Thank you both for your input. That's all for now. I'm Dana Lewis, and that was Inside.